The air in Savannah, Georgia, carried the faint scent of roasted pecans and autumn leaves as Abigail Harper, 38, stepped onto the cobblestone path leading to her mother's house. It was Thanksgiving, and the golden November light bathed the historic district in a warm glow. But Abigail's heart was heavy. In her hands, she held a homemade pecan pie, its crust golden and fragrant, and a set of polished antique crystal glasses, each etched with history. To the world, she was a quiet woman who ran a small antique shop, Harper and Heirloom, tucked beneath ancient oaks on Abercorn Street. She wore vintage cardigans, drove a 15-year-old Volvo, and spent her days dusting relics most dismissed as clutter. But to her family, she was the shadow of their expectations, a single woman with no children, no glittering degree, and a career they deemed a quaint hobby. Abigail's parents, Richard and Evelyn Moore, were pillars of their community. Richard, a retired bank president, measured worth by financial stability and social standing, often boasting that a man's credit score was his true character. Evelyn, a former high school principal, preached that success came from the right college, the right career, and the right spouse. Their pride and joy was Abigail's older sister, Victoria, 42, who embodied their ideals. Victoria had graduated summa cum laude from Yale, built a career as a corporate attorney in Atlanta, married a neurosurgeon named Charles, and raised 2 children who attended elite private schools and played lacrosse by age 8. Their annual Christmas cards were a study in perfection, coordinated outfits, gleaming smiles, a life polished to a magazine sheen. Abigail, by contrast, was the family's quiet disappointment. Her choice to study art history at the University of Georgia had been met with raised eyebrows and sighs. "Art is charming," Evelyn once said, her voice tight, "but it doesn't pay the bills." Abigail still remembered the sting of her mother folding her college application shut, her hands trembling with unspoken judgment. After college, Abigail spent 4 years as an apprentice at an auction house in Charleston, learning to spot the difference between hand-carved mahogany and factory veneer, to detect forged patinas, and to date a chandelier to its precise era, Victorian or Art Nouveau. She once came home buzzing with excitement about a mislabeled 18th-century sideboard, undervalued by $4. Richard had only muttered, "Sounds like a risk." At 29, Abigail took a leap. She drained her savings, secured a modest loan from a college friend, and leased a narrow brick storefront in Savannah's historic district. Harper and Heirloom was born, its shelves lined with Chippendale tables and Georgian silver, each piece displayed like a love letter to the past. On opening day, Evelyn brought a plastic wreath and whispered to a friend, "I hope she outgrows this by 35. From then on, family gatherings became a stage where Victoria shone, her tales of courtroom victories and Aspen vacations stealing the spotlight. Abigail was relegated to the wings, fielding questions like, "Still running that little shop?" or, "Ever thought of teaching art at a community college?" Once, she overheard Richard tell her uncle, "At least she's not on our payroll." What her family didn't see was the magic in Abigail's work. Every item she sold carried a story. A tarnished silver candelabra, bought for $200, kept her awake for nights as she traced its origins to a 19th-century Boston estate, selling it for $5. A cracked porcelain music box, purchased for $50, brought tears to a buyer when it played a melody her grandmother sang in 1939. To her family, it was dust and clutter. To Abigail, it was history revived. But the deepest wound wasn't their dismissal, it was the constant reminder that she was never enough. No Ivy League diploma, no husband, no accolades for Evelyn to flaunt at her book club. Abigail accepted her role as the overlooked daughter, finding peace in the quiet of her shop. Yet one discovery changed everything. At 30, Abigail found a 19th-century French mantel clock in a cluttered barn outside Savannah. The seller, eager to clear space, let it go for $25. After weeks of cleaning its rusted gears and researching its faint engravings, she uncovered its provenance, a rare piece by Japy Frères, crafted for a diplomat under Napoleon III. 3 months later, it sold at a New York auction for $52. Abigail didn't touch the money. She opened a private investment account under an LLC, Palmetto Holdings, separating her personal and business assets. That moment was a revelation. Her passion wasn't just sentimental, it was a precise instrument for creating wealth. She began scouring estate sales across the Southeast, from Wilmington to St. Augustine. Armed with a notebook and an antique authentication app, she learned to spot Federal-era engravings versus 1970s knockoffs, to distinguish hand-stitched upholstery from machine-made reproductions. One find in Charleston, a rare 1820s lithograph hidden in a professor's attic, cost her $150 and sold to a museum for $180. These victories, though rare, were enough to build a fortune. Through Palmetto Holdings, Abigail quietly purchased her shop's building, 2 adjacent apartments, and a nearby lot, all under the LLC's name. Her family remained oblivious, assuming she was scraping by. She let them believe it, choosing vintage dresses over designer labels and sipping coffee from a $10 flea market mug crafted by a forgotten artisan. Her one indulgence was an annual trip to Europe, where she wandered the galleries of Madrid or the bookshops of Lisbon. Soaking in the past, she didn't need validation, she needed time, patience, and the ability to see what others missed. Thanksgiving at Evelyn's house unfolded like a familiar script. Victoria's black Range Rover dominated the driveway, forcing Abigail to park her Volvo down the street. Inside, the scent of turkey and cranberry sauce mingled with the clink of crystal. Victoria, radiant in a tailored blazer, smirked as she greeted her sister. "Good thing you closed the shop today. Abigail, wouldn't want to miss this, right?" Abigail smiled, saying nothing. She'd left her new assistant, Clara, in charge, but Victoria wouldn't grasp the concept of delegation. To her, work meant billable hours, not passion. Abigail peeled potatoes in the kitchen while Victoria plated the turkey, her every move choreographed for praise. Richard entered, bourbon in hand, offering Victoria a warm hug and Abigail a curt nod. "Shop still open?" he asked, already turning to Victoria's latest story about a high-stakes merger. The meal began under the chandelier's golden glow, the table laden with Evelyn's signature sweet potato casserole and cornbread stuffing. Everything felt predictable until Victoria reached for her phone, only to grab Abigail's by mistake. Swiping the screen, she froze. A notification from Abigail's financial advisor, Martin, glowed. "Congratulations. Your net worth just hit $16.8 million. Let's discuss the Wilmington portfolio next week." The room went silent. Victoria's face drained of color. "What the hell is this, Abigail?" she demanded, holding the phone like evidence. Richard's bourbon glass hit the table, spilling. Evelyn's fork clattered. $16 million? Victoria spat. "Your little antique shop did that?" Abigail extended her hand. "My phone, please." Victoria clutched it tighter, eyes blazing. "No. Explain. Where'd this come from? Shady deals? Under the table sales? Because if it's dirty, you're dragging us all down." Abigail's voice was steady. "It's mine. Every dollar. From the work you call playing with junk." Richard's voice trembled. "Is this real, Abigail?" She nodded. The table became a courtroom. Victoria, Charles, and her parents didn't congratulate her. Instead, they calculated. Victoria spoke first, her tone soft but sharp. "My daughter, Elise, has a shot at a ballet program in London. It's competitive, Abigail, but the tuition's steep. You could make her dream happen." Charles chimed in. "You live alone. No kids. No mortgage. Helping family isn't a burden, right?" Evelyn added. "We worried about you for years, thinking you were struggling." Abigail set her fork down. "Worried? No one asked about my work. No one visited the shop after opening day. You mocked it, changed the subject. Now you see a number. And suddenly I owe you?" Victoria's laugh was cold. "You let us think you were broke. Mom lost sleep over your future. And you were sitting on a fortune like some secretive heiress." Evelyn's voice cracked. "You go to thrift stores, Abigail. You use a cracked phone. And you're a millionaire?" Abigail's gaze was unflinching. "I wasn't hiding. You just never listened." The tension thickened. Charles, usually silent, spoke up. "You don't need all that money. You live like you're poor. Why not share? Elise's tuition. Our mortgage. $3 million would barely dent your account. Abigail's voice was calm but firm. What about my work? The years I spent learning, risking, building? When you called my shop a hobby, I kept going. Now you want a cut because you see a number? Victoria leaned forward, her voice dripping with guilt. We worried about you. You owe us transparency. Abigail laughed softly. Transparency? You never cared unless it was about Victoria's promotions or Elise's recitals. Evelyn's eyes glistened. You're tearing us apart over money. What do you need it for? Alone with no family? That cut deep. Abigail stood, her chair scraping the floor. I'm not leaving, she said, voice low. I'm setting a boundary you just tried to cross. She stepped onto the porch, the November chill biting through her thin sweater. Inside, the clink of silverware resumed. But it sounded like a boardroom, not a family dinner. Abigail gripped the railing, her breath visible in the cold. For the first time, she felt clear, not angry, but free. The November wind howled through the cobblestone streets of Savannah, Georgia, as Abigail Harper stood on her mother's porch, the weight of Thanksgiving dinner still heavy in her chest. The air was sharp, cutting through her thin wool scarf. But inside, her resolve burned hotter than the chandelier's glow back in the dining room. Just moments ago, she'd walked out on her family, not in anger, but in defiance of a narrative that had cast her as the lesser daughter for too long. Abigail, 38, was no stranger to being underestimated. Her small antique shop, Harper and Heirloom, was a haven of forgotten treasures on Abercorn Street. But to her family, it was a quaint distraction. A hobby for a woman who'd failed to climb the ladder of their expectations. Tonight, that illusion had shattered, and the fallout was only beginning. 10 minutes earlier, the dining room had been a battlefield. Abigail's sister, Victoria, had grabbed her phone by mistake, revealing a notification from her financial advisor. Your net worth just hit $16.8 million. The words hung in the air like a guillotine. Victoria's face twisted with shock and suspicion, her voice slicing through the warm haze of turkey and cranberry sauce. $16 million? From your little shop? Her parents, Richard and Evelyn, stared, their forks frozen mid-bite. The room turned from a family gathering into a courtroom, with Abigail on trial for a crime she hadn't committed. Success. Instead of congratulations, accusations flew. Victoria demanded answers, hinting at shady deals. Her husband, Charles, suggested Abigail's simple life, vintage clothes, a 15-year-old Volvo, meant she didn't need the money. Evelyn, her voice trembling, asked why she'd hidden her wealth, as if it were a betrayal. They didn't see her years of work. They saw a number and claimed a stake. Abigail's response was calm but unyielding. I earned every cent. You called my work a hobby. But it built this. When Victoria pushed, demanding money for her daughter's ballet program, and Charles suggested $3 million was a small price for family, Abigail drew a line. No one visited my shop. No one asked about my finds. You didn't care until you saw a dollar sign. The room grew colder than the November night. Victoria's threat was sharp. If you walk out without helping, don't expect to be invited to Elise's graduation. Evelyn's tearful plea. You're tearing us apart, cut deep. But Abigail's clarity was stronger. She stepped outside, not fleeing, but reclaiming her worth. I'm not leaving, she said, her voice steady as she faced them. I'm setting a boundary you just crossed. The porch was quiet now. The only sound the rustle of leaves skittering across the cobblestones. Abigail's hands gripped the railing, her breath visible in the chill. She wasn't the daughter who'd spent years shrinking under their judgment. She was the woman who'd turned forgotten relics into a fortune, who'd built a life on her terms. Back inside, the clinking of silverware resumed. But it sounded like a boardroom negotiation, not a family meal. Abigail knew returning to that table meant surrendering her truth. Instead, she walked to her Volvo, the engine humming to life as she drove back to Savannah, to the sanctuary of Harper and Heirloom. The shop was dark when she arrived, its shelves lined with stories no one in her family cared to hear. Upstairs, in her modest apartment, Abigail sat by the window, watching the streetlights flicker on Abercorn Street. Jazz notes drifted from a nearby cafe. Soft and mournful. Her phone buzzed. A text from Evelyn. You hurt us. But I love you. Abigail set the phone down. Not out of anger, but as a reminder. The voices that mattered didn't demand her guilt. They listened. The next morning, she opened the shop early. Not to sell, but to cleanse. The scent of lemon polish filled the air as she wiped down a 19th-century walnut table. Each stroke erasing the weight of yesterday's accusations. Clara, her 24-year-old assistant, arrived with a cappuccino and a worried frown. You okay? I texted you last night. Abigail smiled, taking the warm cup. Better than you'd think. Clara was a godsend. A college senior with a passion for Victorian glassware and a knack for spotting hand-etched patterns. Hiring her was one of Abigail's best decisions. Not just for the shop, but for the mentorship she could offer, something Abigail had craved in her own early years. In the weeks that followed, she poured herself into Harper & Heirloom, transforming it into more than a store. She launched a blog, Echoes of Eras, detailing the evolution of American furniture from colonial to craftsman. The posts went viral among collectors, drawing emails from enthusiasts and even a request to apprentice from a retired curator. Abigail began hosting Tea and Treasures events on the first Saturday of each month, filling the shop with neighbors, students, and collectors. They sipped chamomile tea and swapped stories about a 1790s mirror owned by a forgotten poet or a set of crystal goblets lost in a Charleston warehouse. No one asked about her bank account. They asked, how do you know this chair's from 1820? Or, what's the story behind this locket? They cared about the history, not the profit. One afternoon, while packing a rare Meissen vase for a client in Seattle, Abigail received an email from a small museum in Richmond. They wanted her to lead a workshop on colonial cabinet making, recommended by a professor she'd once helped authenticate a 1780s desk. It was a quiet moment of triumph. Proof that her work had a voice beyond her family's dismissal. She was no longer Victoria's shadow, she was Abigail Harper. A name that carried weight in circles that valued her craft. By December, Abigail's world had expanded. She sat with Clara one evening, sipping cider by the shop's fireplace, when Clara handed her a sketchbook. Inside was a proposal. Transform the shop's backroom into a preservation workshop. A space for hands-on classes and exhibits. We could train young people who love this stuff, Clara said, her eyes bright. Like me, Abigail studied the detailed drawings, shelves for tools, a workbench for restoration, a corner for lectures. You're dreaming big, she said, smiling. Clara grinned. I learned from someone who does. That night, Abigail called her advisor, Martin, and allocated $300 to create the Palmetto Fund, a scholarship for students passionate about heritage preservation, antique design, or applied art history. Applicants had to submit a real-world project. No exceptions. By February, 52 applications poured in from 14 states. The first recipient was Mia Rodriguez, 26, who'd left college to support her family but taught herself to restore 18th-century textiles. Her application included photos of a hand-stitched quilt she'd saved from a barn, along with a note, I don't want to chase trends. I want to save the past for the kids who'll never see it otherwise. When Abigail called to award the scholarship, Mia sobbed, You just kept me from going back to a call center. Those words lingered, a reminder of what Abigail's work could do, not just for her, but for others. The shop's back room became the archive, a vibrant space for workshops and exhibits. By April, it was standing room only for lectures on Georgian silver or Federal-era joinery. One evening, a visitor arrived unannounced, Abigail's cousin, Rachel, a furniture restorer from Asheville who'd skipped family gatherings for years. I heard about your classes on a preservation forum, Rachel said, grinning. Didn't know it was you. This is incredible. Over coffee, they planned a joint course on Southern woodworking and ecology. Blending their passions, Abigail realized her world wasn't confined to her shop's walls, it was growing, connecting her with people who saw her for who she was. Thanksgiving came again, but this time, Abigail rewrote the script. She invited her parents to Savannah, to her apartment above the shop. Just the three of us, she told Richard over the phone. There was a pause. Then a simple, "Evelyn would like that." No apologies. But no blame either. It was enough. On the day, they arrived under a crisp autumn sun. Evelyn wore a navy coat, her silver hair pinned neatly. Richard sported a faded Braves cap, his sunglasses reflecting the shop's warm glow. "It's different in the afternoon light," Evelyn said, stepping inside, more alive. Richard ran a hand over a 1790s sideboard. "How old's this?" he asked. "Circa 1810, Abigail replied. "Hand-carved, owned by a Savannah merchant." He nodded, his eyes lingering, a small shift, but noticeable. Upstairs, the table was set with rosemary roasted turkey, garlic mashed potatoes, and a pecan pie baked that morning. The meal was simple but deliberate, a reflection of Abigail's life, crafted with care. Not for show. They ate in quiet harmony. Richard asked about her classes. Evelyn shared neighborhood gossip, and no one mentioned Victoria or the $16.8 million. After dessert, Abigail handed Evelyn a small box. Inside was a 19th-century silver peony brooch, its petals delicate as memory. "It reminded me of the peonies you grew when I was a kid," Abigail said. Evelyn's fingers brushed the metal, her voice soft. "You remember that?" Abigail nodded. "I remember everything." The room stilled. Richard cleared his throat. "We thought you needed to follow Victoria's path to be safe. We were wrong." It wasn't an apology, but it was close. Evelyn's eyes met hers, a faint nod saying more than words. As they left, Abigail stood on the shop's steps, watching their car disappear. No old wounds reopened, no ache lingered. She'd spoken her truth, held her ground, and offered connection without compromise. That night, Abigail sat in the shop, surrounded by relics that whispered of lives long gone. She opened her journal and wrote, "Thanksgiving wasn't a test this year. It was just dinner, where I didn't need permission to be me." Her family might never fully understand her, but they no longer held the power to define her. Abigail had built a world of her own, a community of curious minds, a legacy of preservation, and a life rooted in purpose. In a society obsessed with titles and wealth, she'd chosen a quieter path, one where worth wasn't measured by applause, but by the courage to stand alone in the hands that built something lasting.